Halloween night had arrived, and with it, a storm that howled through town, rattling windows and bending trees. I hadn't planned on doing anything unusual that night, just a quiet night in, avoiding trick-or-treaters. But then my phone buzzed. It was Mark, my old friend from high school. We hadn't talked in years, but there it was. A text. "You still live near the old amusement park, right? Meet me there tonight. It's important." I almost ignored it. Who shows up out of the blue with a text like that? But curiosity won. It was Halloween after all. And something about that text, strange as it was, pulled me in. The old amusement park had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Most of the rides were rusty skeletons now, lost to time and decay. They'd locked up the gates long ago, but tonight, when I arrived, I found them wide open, swaying in the wind. I hesitated. The place felt wrong, but I pushed on, hoping to find Mark quickly and leave just as fast. I wandered through the silent grounds, my footsteps swallowed by the eerie quiet, when I heard something, footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. I spun around and there was Mark, standing by an old mirror in the middle of what used to be the funhouse. His back was to me, his face reflected in the cracked glass. "Mark?" I called, my voice sounding small. He didn't answer, just stared at his reflection. And then I noticed something. His face looked wrong, distorted, stretched, as though the reflection itself was warped. Are you all right?" I asked, walking closer. The reflection shifted, turning to look at me even though Mark's body hadn't moved. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was seeing. The Mark in the mirror was watching me, his eyes dark, a strange grin spreading across his face. Mark turned suddenly, snapping me out of my trance. He looked confused, almost afraid. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he whispered. I nodded, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. He didn't explain. He just started walking, muttering to himself, and I followed. We passed through the old Midway, its carnival games long forgotten, prizes left to rot. Every few steps I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, like shadows slipping just out of sight. The place felt alive, charged with a strange energy. We stopped in front of the haunted house attraction, its facade peeling and covered in graffiti. Mark turned to me, his face pale in the dim light. "I have to show you something," he said. He led me inside, down a narrow, pitch-black hallway, the only sound the creak of our footsteps. I barely caught sight of his hand reaching for an old, cracked mirror on the wall. "This one," he whispered. "Watch it closely." I stared into the mirror, expecting to see nothing but our reflections. But as I watched, my reflection started to change. My face warped, skin stretching in impossible ways, eyes sinking until I barely recognized myself. And then it grinned, a cold, mocking smile. I jerked back, heart pounding, but Mark held me in place, his grip surprisingly strong. "Why did you bring me here, Mark?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "Because," he whispered, "I'm not the only one. This, whatever this is, it's looking for others. It watches." His voice trailed off as he stared back at the mirror. Suddenly, a voice echoed down the hall. A low, rasping voice, like 2 people speaking at once. It was impossible to tell where it came from, yet it sounded close. "One. More." We turned to run, stumbling down the hallway, each step feeling like it pulled us deeper into the dark. But the place seemed to shift around us. Doors we'd passed were gone. The narrow hallway stretched longer and longer, until I wasn't sure if we were moving forward at all. The mirrors along the wall began to vibrate, each one reflecting back twisted versions of us, images flickering with faces that weren't our own. Mark grabbed my arm, his voice barely a whisper. "It's been waiting," he said, his face pale. "It's been waiting for someone to see it." The final mirror loomed before us, and as we reached it, we both stopped. Our reflections were wrong again. This time they were standing still, even though we were moving. And then, as we watched, they began to move on their own. They leaned closer, their eyes wide, grins spreading across their faces as they raised their hands and pressed against the glass, as if they were trying to break through. Without thinking, I turned, sprinting back down the hallway, yanking Mark along with me. The mirrors rattled, cracked, and then they shattered, sending shards flying. We ducked and ran, reaching the front entrance, barely making it out before the entire funhouse seemed to shudder, as if it were alive, closing in on itself. We didn't stop running until we were out of the park, panting and shaking. Mark collapsed on the ground, his eyes wide, staring at nothing. "What was that?" I whispered. "It's the mirrors," he said finally, his voice hollow. They take something from you when you look into them, something you can't get back. They wait, hoping someone will come and set them free." I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I just wanted to leave that place behind, forget it ever happened. But every so often when I look in the mirror at home, I swear I see something. Someone watching me from deep within the glass. And I know someday it'll find a way to get out. It was Halloween night, and we were all a bit restless. No haunted houses or horror movies would do the trick this time. We wanted something real, something risky. So when Casey, the quietest guy in our group, suggested we visit his family's old property on the outskirts of town, it seemed like the perfect way to wrap up the night. There were rumors about that place, a vacant, time-worn house with a creepy basement no one dared enter. He swore he had a Ouija board we could use, something he'd found in the basement years ago. What was supposed to be a fun dare would turn into one of the most chilling nights of our lives. The place was a textbook haunted house, shutters barely hanging on, weeds covering the walkway, and that kind of silence that sinks into your skin. Casey seemed nervous but shrugged it off when we asked. He kept saying it was just old family junk down there, that no one had touched it since his grandparents passed. The rest of us, Liam, Sophie, and I, laughed it off, more focused on our excitement than any creeping sense of unease. Inside, the house smelled of dust and something faintly sour, like stale wood. We followed Casey down to the basement where the air grew even colder. The space was lit only by the faint light from our phones, revealing piles of forgotten furniture, old crates, and the Ouija board tucked away on a shelf in the corner. Sophie held the board up, eyeing it suspiciously. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, half joking. I'll admit I felt a bit of hesitation then, but I brushed it off. We all did. The board was dusty and old, but the letters were still clear, and the planchette had an odd weight to it, cold and metallic. We sat in a circle on the rough concrete floor, placing the board between us. Casey took the lead, with Sophie and Liam beside him, and I held my breath as we placed our fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" Liam asked in a low, steady voice. Nothing. The silence in the room grew heavier, almost pressing down on us. The planchette didn't move. For a moment I thought the whole thing was going to be a bust, but then it slid to YES. Our laughter stopped cold. Sophie shot me a wide-eyed look, and I noticed Casey's fingers tremble slightly. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice coming out more like a whisper than I intended. The planchette moved again. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled RACHEL. We all glanced at Casey. He looked pale, eyes fixed on the board. "Rachel was my aunt," he said softly. "She died when I was young." An eerie chill filled the air as the basement seemed to close in around us. "Rachel," Sophie continued, Are you at peace?" The planchette paused and then, moving with more force, slid to NO. A sudden anxiety settled over us, like an itch you couldn't quite reach. I noticed the lights from our phones flickering slightly, as if the batteries were draining faster than they should. We pressed on with questions, each more uneasy than the last. Rachel's spirit hinted that she was stuck, unable to leave. And when we asked why, the answer took my breath away. Basement. What? What do you mean? I stammered. Did something happen to you down here? The planchette spelled Look. We exchanged nervous glances. Casey stood up, turning his flashlight to the far corner of the basement, where several large crates and boxes lay stacked. The rest of us followed, our footsteps slow, hesitant. The smell in that corner was worse, damp and sour, as if something had been left to rot. There, beneath a pile of old blankets, we saw it, a set of faint, small scratches etched into the concrete floor. They formed a rough, shallow circle, but what sent a chill down my spine was that the scratches looked recent. "Rachel," Casey muttered. His face was pale, his breath coming fast. He stepped back from the markings, looking genuinely scared. I'd never seen him like this. Back at the board, we asked, "Rachel, did you make those marks?" The planchette shifted, spelling TRAP. It felt like ice had replaced my blood. The words Rachel had spelled were hitting too close to reality for comfort. We realized that maybe Rachel hadn't been alone in this basement after all. But that only led to a more frightening thought. What else might be trapped down here with us? The smell grew stronger, almost suffocating now, and our breaths seemed louder, harsher in the confined space. Liam tried to open the basement door, but it was stuck, as if something on the other side held it shut. Panic set in as we tried again and again, each of us pushing, pounding on the wood, until finally, with a loud crack, it gave way. We stumbled back, gasping for breath. But something was wrong. The hallway light had turned off, casting the whole basement in near darkness. "Rachel, we're leaving," Casey said, grabbing the board as if taking it with him would somehow end everything. "We're leaving and we're not coming back." The planchette jerked across the board in a violent motion. It spelled DONT, almost as if it were a plea. Ignoring it, we made our way up the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When we finally reached the top, we bolted for the door. Outside, the air was cold, refreshing, real. But as we made our way to the car, Sophie looked back at the house and froze. "Guys, look," she whispered. In the window, we could just barely make out a figure, a faint silhouette standing in the shadows, watching us. It didn't move, didn't wave or call out. It just stood there, inhumanly still. We stared, speechless, the reality of what we'd left behind settling in. In the days that followed, we researched the history of the house and Casey's family. We found records of his Aunt Rachel, who had indeed died in her teens under mysterious circumstances. But what haunted us more was a series of deaths in the same house, relatives, guests, all in the basement. Some said it was a gas leak, others hinted at darker things, but no one had any real answers. It seemed plausible, even logical, that Rachel's spirit was one of many trapped there. Casey eventually destroyed the board. None of us spoke about it again, though sometimes I wondered if Rachel had truly been the one communicating with us that night. We never went back to the house, and Casey sold it shortly after. Rational or not, it felt like the right decision, as though we'd left something deeply disturbed back there. And every Halloween, I think about those scratches in the basement, the cold that settled around us, and the silhouette in the window. Whether or not there was a ghost, some things are best left buried. The chill in the air felt different that night. Not the crisp, cool Halloween night you'd expect, but something still heavy. I remember looking down Sycamore Street, every porch light dimmer than it should have been. Maybe it was the fog rolling in, or maybe it was something darker. Whatever it was, that Halloween night was about to take a turn no one could have anticipated. My friends and I, Jake and Sam, had always been up for a scare. But this year, instead of the usual haunted house or corn maze, we wanted to do something different. Something Real. We'd heard rumors about an old, abandoned house at the end of Sycamore Street. The kind people walked past quickly, pretending not to notice. They said it was haunted, not in a fake screams and actors in masks way, but really haunted by something people couldn't explain. We laughed it off. I mean, how scary could an old house be? But as we stood at the wrought iron gate, half hidden by overgrown vines and eerie shadows cast by the streetlight, the laughter faded. The air around the house felt dense, like it was pressing in on us. Even Sam, who never seemed scared of anything, looked a little pale, but no one wanted to back out. Not yet. The front door hung slightly open, creaking with every breeze. We stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under our weight. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the light from our phones as we panned them around. Every room was silent, empty, yet heavy with a presence we couldn't explain. There were strange scratch marks on the walls, deep, uneven gouges that almost looked like letters. But they didn't spell anything, just jumbled shapes, chaotic and unsettling. I forced a nervous chuckle, glancing at Sam and Jake. Probably just some teenagers messing around, I whispered, but my voice sounded wrong in the silence, like it didn't belong. We moved further in, and with each step, it felt like the house was watching us. I don't know how else to describe it, like eyes were fixed on us from every shadowed corner. Then, from upstairs, we heard it, a slow, deliberate thump. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us answered. We just stared up at the staircase, the darkness swallowing every inch beyond the third step. Then Sam, always the brave one, spoke up. "Let's go check it out." He was trying to sound tough, but his voice was shaking. So up we went, one cautious step at a time, each creak of the stairs echoing louder than the last. When we reached the landing, we heard something even more unnerving. Whispering, faint, hushed voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded in my chest as we followed the sounds to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and as we pushed it open, the temperature dropped. It was like stepping into a freezer, our breath misting in the air. In the center of the room was an old rocking chair, and it was moving just the slightest sway back and forth, even though there was no one there. Jake muttered, This isn't funny, guys." We all agreed, but we were frozen in place. We couldn't look away. Then, out of nowhere, Sam screamed and backed up against the wall, his eyes wide, staring into the dark corner behind the rocking chair. "There's something standing there," he choked out. I strained to see, but there was nothing, just a thick, impenetrable shadow. But the air felt charged, like something was looming just beyond our sight, waiting. The whispering grew louder, clearer now, like multiple voices, overlapping in a garbled chant. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut, and we spun around, panic setting in. Jake ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped, and the room grew colder, the air thickening with a foul, musty smell. It felt like the walls were closing in, pressing us toward that dark corner. And then, a voice, low, raspy, and unmistakably real. "Get out!" That was enough. We pounded on the door, shouting, until finally it gave way. We practically fell out of the room, scrambling down the stairs without looking back. But as we hit the front door, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. In the upstairs window, a shadow, thin, crooked, and watching us. When we reached the street, gasping for breath, we turned back. The house looked the same as it had before, quiet, too still. None of us spoke for a while. We just walked back in silence, each of us lost in thought, the weight of what we'd seen settling heavily on us. Later, we tried to rationalize it. An old house, creaking floors, a trick of the light, but that night haunted us. I still don't know what we saw, or if we all just imagined it, but every Halloween since, that house remains empty, abandoned. No one dares go near it, and every now and then, when I walk down Sycamore Street, I swear I can feel eyes watching from that upstairs window, like something's still waiting for someone foolish enough to come back. This story begins on Halloween night, not some random October evening in any old town, but in a small, unassuming town with a cemetery that's been there since the late 1800s. The air was cold and biting, with a crispness that seemed to sharpen each sound and amplify the shuffling of fallen leaves. My friends and I, Lucas, Tom, and Ethan, had heard every story you can imagine about that cemetery, but none of us could have anticipated the real terror we'd encounter that night, using something as seemingly harmless as a board game. Lucas had found an old Ouija board at a garage sale, sealed in a battered box with a faint smell of mildew. He thought it would be a good Halloween laugh, an authentic touch, as he put it, to our night. We were just supposed to play it for a few minutes, get spooked, and then laugh it off. None of us believed it could really connect with anything beyond our nerves. Ethan suggested we go to an abandoned house on the edge of the cemetery, a place notorious for its dark past, as it had been abandoned for over 40 years since a family tragedy took place there. It was the kind of place you'd cross the street to avoid at night, and for years, kids in town dared each other to go inside. For most of us, it was just one more Halloween dare that we'd laugh about later. The house felt colder than the outside air. It had broken windows, a creaky floor, and a strange silence that seemed to grow deeper the further we ventured in. We spread the board on a dusty coffee table and lit a few candles, which barely cut through the darkness. As we placed our fingers on the planchette, I felt a shiver run down my spine. We each gave each other nervous glances. Lucas cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Is anyone here with us?" he asked, his voice steady but quiet. At first, nothing happened. I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. There's no way anything could come through a piece of wood and plastic. But after a few moments, the planchette slowly, almost lazily, moved to yes. We all exchanged looks. Lucas chuckled nervously, his fingers tightening on the planchette. "All right, who are you?" he asked. The planchette began moving again, this time spelling out David. The name didn't mean anything to any of us. "David," Tom repeated softly. "David who?" But then the planchette didn't move. A strange silence fell over us, heavier than before, as if the whole house were holding its breath. After a tense minute, Lucas asked, "Were you here, in this house?" This time, the planchette moved faster. It spelled out Child. A chill settled over us, even more intense than the October cold. I tried to brush it off. It's just a game, I thought. This can't be real. The conversation on the board grew stranger. David claimed he'd once lived in the house but had died as a child. When Tom asked how, the board spelled out Burned. My mind flashed to a memory, something I'd overheard from older relatives, about how a child had died in a fire here decades ago. It was one of those local tragedies no one spoke about openly. The more questions we asked, the more details emerged. David was 8, loved playing in the backyard, and had a dog he missed. He seemed to grow more responsive, as if eager to share. But then, when Lucas asked if he was still here, the planchette jerked abruptly to no. The movement was forceful, far too strong to be any one of us pushing it. Ethan looked around, unsettled, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. "If he's not here, then what is?" he whispered. Then a faint smell began to permeate the room. Burnt wood, sharp and acrid. We hadn't brought anything that could have caused that smell, and we hadn't lit any matches or incense. Lucas's face paled, his voice barely audible when he asked, "David, are we in danger?" The planchette slowly, almost mockingly, spelled Leave. Ethan's hand shot off the board. "I'm done," he whispered, looking around the shadowed corners of the room. But Tom and Lucas were more hesitant. They tried to laugh it off, saying the game must be rigged somehow. Yet, deep down, none of us truly believed it anymore. The air grew colder and heavier as we debated what to do. The candles flickered and shadows seemed to stretch, twisting into strange shapes on the walls. Tom was the one who finally suggested ending the game, reasoning that maybe we disrupted something that shouldn't have been disturbed. With a shaky voice, Lucas asked one last question. "David, if we leave, will you let us go?" The planchette slid to YES, though slowly, as if it wasn't entirely true. Then, almost as if David, or whatever was communicating with us, had one final message, the planchette slid in quick succession, spelling out LISTEN. We froze, and that's when we heard it. Not from the board, but from outside the room. Faint, labored breathing and a dragging sound, like something or someone pulling themselves across the floor. It was close, and it was getting closer. There were no sounds of footsteps, only the dragging, as if something was being pulled along the dusty floor. Ethan bolted for the door. "This isn't a game anymore," he hissed, frantically trying to push the door open, but it was stuck. We pushed and pulled, our breathing rapid and our fingers shaking with panic. The dragging sound drew closer, and the candles began flickering wildly, their dim light casting shifting shadows around the room. Finally, with a loud creak, the door gave way, and we stumbled out into the hallway, the echo of dragging following us as we sprinted out of the house. Back in the safety of Lucas's car, none of us spoke. The reality of what had just happened weighed heavy in the silence. Had it really been a spirit? Or was it some sort of subconscious manipulation, a psychological suggestion we'd all fallen prey to? We all knew about the tragic fire decades ago. Maybe our minds had simply conjured up David as a shared hallucination or trick of suggestion. Still, none of us could explain the sounds or the acrid smell of burning that had filled the room. Nor could we explain how the door had seemed locked at the exact moment we'd tried to escape. That night, back in my own room, I lay awake, convinced it had all been in my mind. After all, the human mind is wired to believe patterns, to make meaning, even if there's none to be found. But deep down, a question lingered, unanswered and unsettling. And every Halloween since, I've wondered if some tragedies can imprint themselves on a place so deeply that they become part of it, repeating on loop like an echo. The four of us never touched a Ouija board again. We don't talk about it, and we don't mention David. Because whether or not it was real doesn't matter anymore. We all agreed that whatever had happened in that house was best left alone.